Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into the 6th century and pulling apart the reign of a figure who packed more raw ambition into one lifetime than almost anyone else in the late antique Mediterranean, Justinian the Most.
He really did. He wasn't an emperor who just, inherited a state. He actively tried to compel it back to what he saw as his lost glory.
And that ambition is exactly why this deep dive is so necessary.
It is. Our sources, they all confirm that Justinian was attempting a full, conscious return to Roman greatness. We're talking reconquest of the lost West, a unified Christian faith,
A total reorganization of the law.
and making sure Constantinople was seen not just as an heir to Rome, but as the continuing true capital.
But the world he was governing it was completely different by then. He was fighting on burning frontiers, dealing with these religious tensions that were centuries deep.
And then on top of everything, he gets hit with a devastating biological crisis that just resets the entire board.
That's the core paradox, isn't it? The one we really need to unpack.
It is. Justinian is what historians sometimes call a figurelinate. On one hand, he's the last gasp of classical Roman ambition. He truly believed in a universal empire, unified by law.
But on the other hand, he was already fully Byzantine. His government was this highly centralized palatial system.
Right. Heavy reliance on a very sophisticated fiscal policy and an administration where, the emperor's authority was completely tangled up with theological legitimacy.
So his legacy it's monumental. You can see it in stone and in legal text. But it's also incredibly fragile because of the sheer cost of that ambition.
Exactly. You really can't understand the transition from antiquity into the Middle Ages without getting a handle on Justinian.
Okay, so let's start with the man himself. He was born Petrus Sebastius around 482 in a provincial Balkan region where Latin was still the main language, so a total outsider.
And that background is everything. His whole push into power comes from his uncle, Justino I, a soldier who worked his way up to become emperor in 518.
And he adopts Justinian, prepares him as his heir.
Yes, and that military Balkan perspective, it gives Justinian this profound belief in the power of the state. He believed that with enough effort, with law and orthodoxy, you could literally refuse the disorder and decline that had shattered the West.
So for him, administrative order wasn't just a dream, it was an achievable goal.
Precisely. Now, to understand any of this, we have to talk about the man who wrote it all down, Procopius of Caesarea. He's our main source, and he is notoriously dangerous to work with.
Right, and here's where it gets so complicated for anyone studying this. Procopius gives us 3 completely different Justinians. How do we even begin to reconcile that?
Well, the short answer is you don't. You can't just reconcile them. You have to read them against each other.
So what are the 3 versions?
First, you have the history of the wars, which is a pretty detailed, fairly straightforward military account. Then there's buildings, which is just pure, lavish propaganda. It's designed to make Justinian's construction program sound almost divine.
And then there's the infamous secret history.
Ah, the secret history. It's a total 180. A brutally hostile, scandalous portrait of the emperor, and maybe especially Empress Theodora.
It's basically a character assassination.
Oh, it's more than that. It was clearly written for a private audience, and it alleges absolute depravity. He even claims Justinian was a demon who could, walk around without his head. That's the level of malice we're dealing with.
Wow, so we have a historical account, a press release, and a political hit piece, all from the same author.
Exactly. So you have to read them critically. The real takeaway isn't that Justinian was a great man or a demon. It's that he was a product of this whole system of the East Roman Empire army, taxes, elites, church, propaganda, all working together.
Let's shift to that system then, specifically inside the palace. We have to talk about Empress Theodora. Procopius hated her, so we need some caution, but she obviously held real power.
Absolutely. Constantinople was a palatial system. Everything depended on access and patronage. And Theodora knew how to command that system. She was huge in court life and especially in religious matters.
She famously protected groups that were outside the official orthodoxy, right?
She did. She often acted as a kind of internal counterweight. Justinian was always pushing for this rigid, top-down uniformity. But Theodora was creating space for dissent within the power structure.
She was a pressure valve.
A vital one, whether she meant to be or not. And this whole dynamic, it really foreshadows one of the empire's core weaknesses. Justinian believed religious unity was essential to run the empire.
But the empire was just too diverse to ever achieve that without it fracturing.
Exactly. And all that friction, religious dissent, resentment over high taxes, It just explodes in 532 with the Nika revolt.
This was the big one, the great internal trauma of his reign.
It was. It starts with the Hippodrome factions, the Blues and the Greens. And you have to say, these weren't just sports fans. They were organized urban networks.
They could mobilize thousands of people.
And they did. They channeled all this popular fury. And the crisis came incredibly close to toppling the government.
And the response was, well, it was utterly brutal. Thousands killed, huge parts of the capital burned to the ground. What lesson did Justinian learn from that?
The lesson was swift and absolute. To control the empire, you have to control the capital. Constantinople had to be stabilized, made untouchable. After Nika, his whole building program got this new, urgent purpose.
It was about declaring that the regime was inevitable, permanent.
Right. And the ultimate symbol of that permanence was the Hagia Sophia, rebuilt and consecrated in 537. This wasn't just a reconstruction. It was a political manifesto.
The architecture itself was propaganda.
Absolutely. The light, the scale.
Yeah.
It was all designed to scream universality of the Christian empire. Procopius's laudatory account in buildings is propaganda, but it captures the intent perfectly. Justinian wanted Constantinople to be the visible center of a divinely ordered world.
And you mentioned this earlier, the idea that for him, building was governing. How did that work in practice?
Well, it meant that huge state projects were used to solidify his power. When you're financing massive infrastructure cisterns, fortifications, the Hagia Sophia, you're controlling resources, you're controlling the powerful guilds, and you're projecting wealth and stability. It was a constant reminder that the central government was in charge.
But the truly durable work, the one that really defined his legacy, was legal. The Corpus Juris Civilis.
Without a doubt. And this wasn't just, collecting old laws. It was a revolutionary political project.
It was about systematizing everything. Its 4 parts, the Codex, the Digest, the Institutas, the Novellas, they fundamentally remade Roman law.
And, crucially, they consolidated the emperor as the sole source of that law.
For those of us not deep into Roman legal history, what's the practical difference between, say, the Digest and the Codex?
That's a great question. The Codex was the collection of imperial law statutes that emperors had actually issued. The Digest, though, was a massive collection of the writings of earlier Roman jurists, centuries of legal commentary.
So by editing and issuing both, he basically put his imperial stamp on the entire legal tradition.
He did. He saw law as the empire's backbone. War could expand the map, but only law could hold the system together.
And what's amazing is that this legal heritage, Justinian's law, it survived even when the empire itself shrank.
It survived for centuries in the East, and it was absolutely fundamental to the medieval legal renaissance in the West, starting around the 11th century. It shaped European civil law traditions right up to the modern day.
Okay, now we have to talk about the project that ate up most of the empire's resources, military reconquest. The whole thing was framed as restoration, right?
Right. It was about recovering Roman provinces usurped by Germanic kingdoms. That rhetoric was key to justifying the immense taxes and sacrifice required. But the reality was much messier.
Because he wasn't recovering intact territories.
Not at all. He was recovering lands that had been totally reconfigured. New elites, new problems, fractured infrastructure. Restoration is always harder and more expensive than simple conquest.
The Vandalic War in Africa was a quick win, though, 533 to 534.
It was a great military triumph for his general, Belisarius. But it immediately set this costly pattern. Winning the battle is just stage 1.
Stage 2 is trying to govern the place.
Exactly. It required a permanent military presence, a huge administrative reorganization.
Yeah.
It was a constant financial drain.
But the war that truly defined, and maybe even ruined the reign, was the Gothic War in Italy. It lasted almost 20 years.
From 535 to 554. The symbolic value was huge, of course. It was Rome. But the cost was just devastating.
It wasn't a clean war. It was a meat grinder.
It really was a brutal cycle of sieges, recaptures, famine, destruction. Cities like Rome and Milan changed hands over and over. It just destroyed the economic foundations of the peninsula.
So even though he technically won in the end under the general Narses, he was left with an impoverished, depopulated, shattered territory.
And that's the central harsh irony of the whole Reconquest project, the long, grinding war he needed to fight to get Italy back. Well, it destroyed Italy's ability to sustain imperial rule in the long term.
It became a permanent, costly garrison mission.
A mission that didn't even last long after his death. And all of this was happening while the Sasanian Persian Empire was a constant threat on the eastern frontier.
Right. So every soldier, every piece of gold sent west to Italy was one less available for the east.
It reveals the permanent, stressful calculus of his reign. Western ambition created Eastern risk. The empire simply did not have infinite resources to fight on two massive fronts at once.
And that lack of infinite resources, it brings us to the structural limits that constrained this whole grand vision. We have to start with the money, with the fiscality.
The Eastern Roman tax machine was probably the most robust administrative system in the Mediterranean. It had to be. It paid for the wars, the buildings, the diplomacy.
But that came at a huge cost. This intense fiscal pressure, administered by ruthless guys like John the Cappadocian, it created deep resentment.
It made the provinces fragile, ripe for revolt. And then, as if that weren't enough, the plague hit.
The plague of Justinian, it starts around 541 and just keeps coming back in waves for decades.
And this wasn't just, a bad flu season. This is a demographic catastrophe. The sources are clear about the incredible mortality rates, the social paralysis,
And the structural consequence.
a massive reduction in the human and productive base. You lose millions of people, you lose your labor force, and you lose your tax base. So you have no money to pay the army.
For an empire already stretched to its absolute limit, that must have just crippled them.
It drastically reduced his margin of maneuverability. It didn't just slow things down, it fundamentally changed the empire's long-term trajectory. Ambitious projects continued, but they were now built on a much, much shakier foundation.
And finally, we have to come back to that unity dilemma, religion. He tried so hard to impose orthodoxy, but the empire had these deep fissures, especially in the East.
The controversy over the 3 chapters is the perfect example of the trap he was in. Any theological move he made, no matter how sincere, risks alienating a major faction, either the Pope in the West or his crucial wealthy provinces in the East.
So he could legislate and punish, but he could never achieve that real, deep unity he craved.
Never. It was a constant source of internal drain.
So Justinian dies in 565. He leaves behind an empire that's geographically massive again, with Africa and Italy back on the map, and culturally defined forever by Hagia Sophia and the Corpus Juris Civilis.
He leaves an apex of late Rome, no question. But here's the final paradox. The sheer weight of his own ambition, the long wars, the financial pressure, the religious tension, and the plague, all of that reduced the empire's ability to actually sustain those conquests.
So his legacy in law and stone was permanent, but the political structure was weakened by the very effort of creating it. He expanded the map, but increased the strategic burden.
Precisely. The empire he left to successors was bigger on paper, yes, but it was significantly heavier to govern, much harder to hold together.
So stepping back from all the details, what's the one essential takeaway for you, the listener, trying to get a handle on this whole era?
Justinian reached for universality. He achieved his goal of, in a sense, recovering Rome's past. But in doing so, he revealed the structural fragility of trying to pull off such a massive project in a world that had been transformed by plague and fractured identity. His monumental reign ensured that the question for the next generation of rulers was no longer, what more can we conquer? But instead, what on earth is sustainable?
He embodied both the greatest achievement and the greatest crisis of that transition from antiquity to the Middle Ages.
Exactly. His text and his stones survived, but the financial system that paid for them ultimately did not. And that is the project worth studying.